How many of you have ever heard of Bear Grylls? It's a picture of Bear. Bear is the outdoor adventure guy. He's known for being the youngest Brit to ever climb Mount Everest, but he's probably best known for his Discovery Channel show, Man vs. Wild. And in this Discovery Channel show, Bear is parachuted into these inhospitable regions, deserts, mountain areas, forests, and they drop him all off in there to fend for himself. And while he's there, he kind of explores and he works his way out of his confined or out of this wilderness to safety. Now, Bear is a cool guy. Think about this. They drop him off into nowhere with nothing, and this dude explores and survives and makes his way out. And really, how can you not be cool with a name like Bear? Now, deep inside, I've always kind of wanted to be like Bear. When I watch the show, I think, man, I could be like Bear. Think about it, Bear Olsson. It's kind of fitting, isn't it? Bear Olsson. Well, you laugh because it's not really fitting at all. As much as I'd like to be that outdoor adventure guy, I'm not much of an outdoors guy. I'm not really much for adventure, and I'm really not a survivalist. But Bear, he is. And there are times when I would love to be just like him. And you ever watch him on the show, and when he's on the show, he's always got to fend. He's always got to find his own food. Well, one day when I was out in the wilderness, or at least my backyard, I was kind of pretending to be like Bear. And I was walking around thinking, well, I remember that episode where Bear was in the forest and he had to find his own food. And so he's in the forest, and what does Bear do? Bear comes to the logs, right? And he looks at the logs, and when he looks at the logs, what's underneath the logs? Bugs, worms, creatures. And then Bear, he eats those bugs and creatures and worms. Well, I couldn't do that. But as I was looking under the log and the light shined down on those creatures, something happened. What do you think happened? Those bugs, those creatures, when the light hit them, they scurried away. They ran away. They couldn't stand the light. And then I sat there and I stared a little bit longer, and I'm kind of looking at the ground and looking at these bugs that took off, and I'm thinking about that ground. And I'm thinking to myself, that same light that caused the bugs to scurry and run is going to cause the seeds in the ground to sprout. And eventually, those seeds in the ground, when they sprout, they're going to lead to grass or flowers or whatever those seeds are. But it was interesting to me that the same light that caused the bugs to scurry causes the seeds to grow. Two completely different results. This morning we're going to look at a story together that speaks of two completely different results. Now I want you to imagine a scene where there's a group of properly dressed religious guys. And these properly dressed religious guys are kind of wrestling with somebody. And they're wrestling with this guy, this once blind beggar, and they throw him down the temple steps. And there's a few of the guys that are doing the heavy lifting, but all of the guys are surrounding him, and they're yelling obscenities, they're cursing at him, and they're giving him violent threats. And you see this guy kind of roll down the temple steps, and you're watching from afar, and you see this scrawny, once blind man stand up and brush himself off. And then you notice on his face a distinct smile. And you ask yourself, I wonder what in the world all of that was about. Well, I'm glad you asked, because we're going to lay a little background, and then, as I'm sure you can imagine, It all starts with Jesus. This morning we're in John chapter 9. It's found on page 758 in the Bible that the church provides. And we're going to be looking at this story of the blind man given sight this morning. But before we do that, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork. We have to go back to John chapter 7 and John chapter 8 before we look at John chapter 9 and recognize that these three chapters are very closely linked. Now, if you'll recall, 3 weeks ago, we did the celebration of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And we recognized that this Feast of the Tabernacles, we learned that it is like Christmas and Easter put together. It's this incredibly joyous time, this great celebration where the people from all around come to Israel for 7 days and camp. And they celebrate what God has done in their lives, and they anticipate what God's going to do in the future. And it's this huge party. And they come to celebrate. And 3 weeks ago, we learned that there were 2 ceremonies that made up this Feast of the Tabernacles. And one of the ceremonies that we learned about 3 weeks ago was the ceremony of water, where the people of Israel came together and gave thanks to God for providing water while they were wandering in the wilderness. God provided them life through water, and they recognized this during the Feast of the Tabernacles. But there was a second ceremony that they celebrated during the Feast of the Tabernacles. And that was a ceremony of light. And the ceremony of light was meant to commemorate the fact that God, while they were in the wilderness, provided them direction, provided them guidance through a pillar of fire that led them by night. God was their light. He gave them water to quench their thirst, to provide them life, and he gave them light in direction and guidance. And so what the people would do during the Feast of Tabernacles is beginning on the second evening and every evening thereafter, they would gather in the court of men, and they would walk from the court of men to the court of women. And while they were walking, they would sing and they would repeat Psalms 120 through 134 over and over, giving praise and glory to God for what he had done. And when they came to the court of the women, they would enter into this court and they would recognize that there were 4 huge candelabras awaiting them. 4 huge candlesticks. And on the top of each of these 4 huge candlesticks, there were 4 huge bowls of oil. And so what we've done is we've kind of created our own candlestick here, our candle or candelabra of light. And the people would come into the court of women, and there would be priests, I'm assuming the very young priests, who would climb to the top of these candelabras 73 feet high. Now, to give you a little bit of perspective, the floor to the ceiling here is about 53 or 54 feet. If you take 2 of these and add it onto our ceiling, that is approximately 73 feet in height. The people would come in, and there were these 4 huge candelabras awaiting them with the 4 large bowls of oil, 16 bowls of oil in total. The priest would climb up to the top, they'd light the bowls, they'd erupt into flames, and it was said that the light was so great from these candelabras that it would provide light to all the courtyards of Jerusalem. It was as if as if night had become day, completely lit up. And once the candelabras were lit, the celebration would really begin then, and they would sing and they would dance through the night, praising God for what he has done in their lives and what he was going to continue, what they anticipated he was going to continue to do. Now imagine that the ceremony is ended. It's over. The party's done. The Feast of the Tabernacles is over, and the lights go out. The candelabras are still there, but there's no light. So at night, darkness has returned. Well, a few days after the ceremony, Jesus enters the court of the women. And he walks into the court of the women, and he stands amongst the people, and he cries out, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Can you imagine? The Feast of the Tabernacles is done. It is now dark where there was light, and the people of Israel had just been celebrating for 7 days all that God provided. He provided water, and God provides and is light. And now Jesus stands up, and he says, I am the light of the world. Now, this isn't the first outrageous statement Jesus made, is it? We saw in John chapter 6 that he said, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of me will never be hungry again. In John chapter 7, he says, if you are thirsty, come to me and drink, and you will never be thirsty again. And now, as we read in John 8, verse 12, he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows after me will never walk in darkness, for they will have the light of life. Incredibly bold, outrageous statements declaring his messiahship and his godlikeness. And then finally, at the end of chapter 8, he says, probably the most incredible statement of all, specifically claiming to be God. He says, before Abraham was born, I am. Before Abraham was born, I am. He uses the personal name of God to describe himself. And what does this do? This causes the Pharisees and the Jews to be incredibly up in arms. They pick up stones because they want to stone him, but Jesus escapes. And now that brings us to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, we see that Jesus meets this blind beggar, a man blind from birth, a man never having received sight. And in chapter 9, Jesus is going to give us a concrete illustration of what it means that he is the light of the world. So John chapter 9, page 758. And notice here how John carefully sets the stage for the miracle in this opening verse, in these opening verses. Look at verse 1. As he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. It's interesting to hear that Jesus notices this man first. The man is beside the temple begging for money. He's not begging to be healed. He's begging for his survival, and Jesus is the one that notices him first. We don't see the man crying out for healing. We don't see the man crying out to Jesus. In fact, the opposite happens. Jesus initiates the healing. Jesus initiates the contact with this man. Jesus shows compassion on him. But as is often the case, the disciples want to go in a completely different direction. When the disciples learn that the man was born blind, they try to launch into a theological, philosophical discussion. Look what they ask in verse 2. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, the disciples ask this question because they understand that there's often a connection between sin and human suffering, and that sickness is sometimes a result of sin in the life of an individual. But look at Jesus' response. Although Jesus acknowledges the possibility in other cases, in the case of this blind man, he tells us in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. In essence, Jesus was saying that a philosophical discussion is not all that important at this moment. Suffice it to say that neither of them sinned. His mission here, because recognize that he is on a mission, and his mission here is to be the light of the world, and he's going to demonstrate it by showing compassion on this man and healing him. So right before Jesus heals the man, look what he says in verse 5. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus establishes a clear connection between the healing of the blind man and his claim to be light of the world. While Jesus previously claimed, he's now going to demonstrate by this miracle. And then in 6 and 7, we see that the miracle is described. Having said this, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now notice that John wastes no words in describing the miracle. He states it matter-of-factly. He washed, he went, he washed, and he came back seeing. And although there's a focus on the physical healing, it seems to be limited. It's as if John wants us to see something more, and Jesus is going to show us something more important. So after Jesus heals the man, exposing him to physical light, the man begins a journey. And this journey is going to bring him face to face with who Jesus truly is. You see, physical sight is important, but it's never enough. So Jesus realizes that this man needs to go on a journey towards spiritual sight, towards what's much, much more important. Now notice, as we continue, the man's progression in his estimate of Jesus. Now, as you can imagine, it didn't take long for the word to spread. His neighbors are kind of the first to notice, and they recognize that this man that was once blind can now see. And so they're confused, and they're wondering what's happened. Even some of them don't even think that it was the man who was born blind. They think that there has to be something else here. Something else is going on. But they definitely wanted to know how this man's eyes were opened. So they ask him, and look how he replies in verse 11. The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Pretty direct, isn't he? He doesn't know much, but he knows who healed him. The man they call Jesus. This is the man's first description of Jesus. But as we're going to see, his understanding of Jesus grows over time. Now, unfortunately, things get difficult for the man. His neighbors decide to take him to the Pharisees to try to figure out what's going on here, to try to understand what's happened. Now remember, the Pharisees are the religious leaders of the day, and they're not happy that Jesus is on the scene. And so they have this hearing, this official hearing, and initially there are 2 points that are established. The first point that is established is apparently this man has been healed by Jesus. And second, this healing occurred on the Sabbath, and that was a problem. Look at the Pharisees' reaction in verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" So they were divided. Now they're not completely sure what to do with this healing, but their minds seem to be made up. This man can't be from God. Their frustration is growing, so they turn to the man and they ask him what he thinks. Who do you think Jesus is? So the man replies in verse 17, or we see in verse 17, finally they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." Now we see some spiritual growth in the man. He first responds that the person who healed him was the man they call Jesus. And now when asked, he says that this man is a prophet, a man from God, a man of God. All his testimony to this resistance has led to an increase in his understanding of who Jesus is. However, the Pharisees, they don't like this answer. Totally unacceptable to the opposing Pharisees. And they're getting more and more combative. This has to be a hoax. This could not have happened. There is no way that this man who was born blind can now see, and Jesus is the result. So they figure out, let's go to the source. Let's go to this guy's parents and see if this is actually the man. Well, when they get to the parents are guardedly tight-lipped, and understandably so, because the parents know that the Pharisees have issued a decree that if anybody claims that Jesus is the Messiah, they are going to be kicked out. They are going to be kicked out of the synagogue and excommunicated. So they're tight-lipped. So they say, yes, he's our son. Yes, he was born blind at birth. But in regards to how he was healed or who did the healing, you can go back and talk to him. He's of age. He can answer for himself. The resistance grows even more intense. Look at verse 24. A second time, the Pharisees summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God, they said. Now, this is not the way you and I give glory to God. This is not like worshiping God or singing praises to God. This statement, give glory to God, is putting the man under an oath. It's saying you need to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. They had made up their minds. When exposed to the light of the world, they chose darkness. But the man refuses to succumb to their pressure and become involved in a theological argument. And instead, he testifies with his experience. Look at verse 25. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. An incredible statement. This man is not drawn into a theological debate. He's just telling them what Jesus did for him. Once I was blind, now I see. He knows exactly what happened to him. But it's still not enough for the Pharisees. Look at verse 26. Then they asked him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And now his patience gives way to exasperation, and he sticks it to him. Look what he says. Do you want to become his disciples too? Ouch. Then they hurl insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. That admission was a fatal mistake. At least, and now they had admitted that they did not know something, and the man jumps on it. Look at it in verse 30. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. He's got them with this logical, simple argument. He's pinned them to the wall. Look at how he continues. Verse 32, nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Look at how he's grown. He first identified his healer as the man they call Jesus. And then he refers to Jesus as a prophet. And now when pressed, he says, this is a man sent from God. The man's eyes are opening wider. He is beginning to see more and more clearly, while the eyes of the Pharisees are becoming darker and darker. The Pharisees, they cannot handle this man's argument, so they attack him. They accuse him of being born blind in sin, and they hit him with the "how dare you lecture us" line. Ultimately, they have enough of him, and they throw him out. They kick him out of the synagogue. They excommunicate him. But don't miss this. Don't miss this man's beautiful and powerful argument. He's saying to these Pharisees, how can you miss this point so terribly? You're facing the greatest miracle, perhaps of all time. Nobody has ever heard of a man being born blind from birth being healed. This has never been spoke of in our nation before. And now this man comes along and he gives sight to one who was born blind. And you choose to argue, you choose to ignore, you choose to push away any reference to this. Because he does not fit within your little box of rules. And because he did not do what you wanted him to do or didn't want him to do on the Sabbath, you argue against this man. But unfortunately, it's the timeless tragedy of all people, isn't it? The false notion that man thinks that God ought to operate by man's rules. And when we look at these Pharisees and we think, how could they do that? The truth is that sometimes we do that. We think that God ought to operate by our rules instead of us operating by God's rules. But notice this man's perception of Jesus. From the man they call Jesus to a prophet, and now from one sent by God. Through the opposition of the Pharisees and his willingness to testify, to speak on behalf of Jesus, his knowledge and his understanding of Jesus grows. So now, spiritually speaking, he has come to his pool of Siloam. And immediately we read in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when Jesus found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Do you believe in the Messiah? "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. What an incredibly beautiful scene. Notice that just like before, Jesus found the man. After he had been kicked out, after he had been excommunicated, Jesus finds him. And after this man's long journey toward Jesus, Jesus opens his eyes, his spiritual eyes, with the simple words, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Immediately, the man responds by falling on his knees and worshiping Jesus, the Christ, this light of the world. Now that is an incredible story. It's an incredible miracle. But it happened almost 2,000 years ago. So what does it have to do, or what does it have to say to you and to me this morning? I have two things that I think it says to us. First, this story addresses those who attempt to remain neutral on Jesus Christ. This morning, we need to understand that there is no neutrality when it comes to Jesus. You are either for Jesus or you are against Jesus. Neutrality is just a sophisticated or acceptable way of rejecting him. There is no neutrality when it comes to Jesus. In this story, we see that there was very significant evidence presented. And some people accepted the evidence, but there were others that completely rejected the evidence, and there was no middle ground available. In fact, Jesus is very, very clear on this. Look at verse 39. Look at what Jesus says. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." You see, Jesus, the light of the world, he identifies two types of people. He identifies those who are blind and will see, and he identifies those who see and will become blind. You see, the light that provides sight to the blind is the same light that blinds the seeing. Two different results to the same light. So in order to be for Jesus, we need to recognize and understand that the way of seeing is actually the way of the blind. Charles Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher, said it this way: "It's not our littleness that hinders Christ, but our bigness. It's not our weakness that hinders Christ, it is our strength. It is not our darkness that hinders Christ, it is our supposed light that holds him back." You see, all too often, we, like the Pharisees, we think we can see. We think that we're big. We think that we're strong. we think that we have light. And when that's the case, we are actually blind. You see, the blind beggar is to be our example. He recognized that he was blind. He recognized that he was poor. He recognized that he needed to beg to survive. And as a result, what happened? Jesus showed up. Jesus found him in his weakness. And he gave sight to the blind man. And for the Pharisees, they all thought they could see. They thought they were strong. They thought they were big. They thought they had light. And he enters into their life, into their existence, and they become blind. The same light causes the blind to see and causes those who think they can see to be blind. So when we come to Jesus, don't come in bigness and strength and thinking you have the light. Come small and weak and in need, and I promise you, he will show up. Second, although we said you cannot remain neutral when it comes to Jesus, it's okay and it's even good to be on a journey toward Jesus. You see, in the story of the blind man, we recognize that Jesus first found him and gave him physical sight, but then this man went on a journey. His spiritual eyes were opened incrementally. Remember what we said? He first claims, he references Jesus as the man they call Jesus. And then he refers to him as a prophet. And then he says he's a man from God. And finally, when Jesus finds him again, he says, I believe. And he falls and worships Jesus. Now, you need to recognize that, yes, Jesus found him first. But this man acted, didn't he? He did something to move towards Jesus. What is it that he did to take steps towards his spiritual sight? He spoke. When he faced questions, when he faced adversity, he spoke of Jesus. And he testified to his experience, to the truth that he saw. And he spoke and gave truthful testimony about Jesus. And what ended up happening? He ended up growing in faith and knowledge to who Jesus truly is, because he spoke of him. So if you're on a journey this morning, if you are on this journey towards spiritual sight, it's okay. It's good. Recognize that the journey is not an end in itself. The end is spiritual sight. And you need to continually be moving in that direction, but know how you move in that direction. In your experiences, recognize Jesus. In what's happening around you, recognize Jesus. And then speak of it to others. Speak of Jesus to others. Your family, your friends, your acquaintances, those at work. Start talking about Jesus. And I promise you that if you, amidst the questions, amidst the adversities, if you speak of Jesus, he will reveal more and more of himself to you. You cannot remain neutral on Jesus Christ. You will either be for or against him. And although you cannot remain neutral, you can be on a journey towards him. And that's okay. I have one last question for you in closing. How does the light affect you? You see, the light shines on everybody. The light of Jesus Christ shines on each one of us. But there are two totally different responses. How does the light affect you? Do you run from it? Or do you run towards it?